In the ruins of a shattered battlefield, where steel carcasses of once mighty machines lay silent beneath drifting smoke, one man refused to surrender to destruction. He was known among soldiers not by rank or uniform, but by reputation, the Mad Mechanic. His real name was Anton Keller, a quiet, broad-shouldered engineer from a forgotten village near the Rhine. But to the men who saw him work, he was something more than human, a mind forged from chaos, capable of breathing life back into dead machines. When the Allied bombers tore through his regiment's position in the spring of 1944, most of his unit scattered. Tanks that once rolled with thunder now sat crippled, their tracks shattered, their armor split like old bone. But Keller stayed. In that smoking graveyard of war, surrounded by twisted iron and death, he began a work that would turn him into legend. With no proper workshop, no spare parts, and no orders, he stripped the ruined beasts of war, piece by piece, scavenging the remnants of wrecks around him, one burnt engine from a Panzer IV, a broken suspension arm from a Tiger, a fuel line from a half-track. He welded, forged, and rewired under the thunder of distant artillery, his hands blistered, his face blackened with oil. Men called him insane, but those who passed by his makeshift camp whispered that they saw sparks like lightning dancing in the night, a man possessed by genius or madness, they could not tell. For weeks, he toiled in solitude, a mechanic against the gods of destruction, reshaping metal and will into something no manual had ever described. That he was driven not by command or patriotism, but by defiance, a belief that a machine could still rise from death if a man refused to let it die. His tools were primitive, a hammer, a welding torch stolen from an abandoned depot, and his bare hands. Each night he worked by the glow of flames, turning scrap into purpose. When soldiers returned from the front to rest, they found him still there, sweat pouring down his face, whispering calculations to himself as though the steel could hear. They mocked him, Keller's building his iron ghost, they said, but curiosity soon replaced laughter. The mechanic's creation was taking shape. The broken hulk of a tank had been reborn into something monstrous, its armor thicker, its engine modified to deliver power beyond its original design. He had fused the best of several machines into one, the strength of the Tiger, the mobility of the Panther, and the cunning improvisation of a field engineer who refused to fail. As the war pressed on and supplies dwindled, soldiers began to rely on him, for repairs, for hope, for miracles. They brought him engines torn by shrapnel, transmissions melted from overuse, and somehow, he made them live again. It wasn't long before rumors reached the command lines, of a madman who could turn ruins into weapons and defeat itself into endurance. When his creation finally roared to life, it wasn't just an engine that started, it was a rebellion. The ground shook as the hybrid tank rolled forward, smoke spitting from its exhausts like a dragon awakening. It was unlike anything the battlefield had seen, an unregistered, unnamed machine that defied both the factory and the front. Soldiers gathered around in awe as Keller climbed atop it, his eyes burning with exhaustion and triumph. He had built not a tank, but a statement, that ingenuity and madness were separated only by victory. The men nicknamed it the Revenant, the tank that came back from the dead. And as it rolled toward the horizon, Anton Keller, the Mad Mechanic, became something between myth and man. In a world defined by orders and obedience, he had proven that one mind, unbound by fear, could outthink destruction itself. The first time the Revenant entered battle, even the sky seemed to hold its breath. The front lines near the Ardennes were a graveyard of burned armor and shattered will, but when Anton Keller drove his creation from behind the smoldering tree line, it was as if the ghost of war had returned to challenge its makers. The hybrid machine, a patchwork of steel salvaged from ruin, moved with a grace no factory-built tank could mimic. Its engine growled with a strange, uneven rhythm, a reminder of its tortured birth, yet it carried power that shocked even seasoned crews. The German officers who first saw it believed they were witnessing a hallucination, a broken tank resurrected by stubborn madness. But then the Revenant fired, and disbelief turned to reverence. Its modified gun thundered through the forest, shattering an Allied armored column before they could adjust their aim. The enemy mistook it for a new model, a secret weapon unleashed at the war's dying hour. Within minutes, word spread across the field, the mad mechanic's monster was real. Keller drove like a man who had built his soul into metal. Inside the cramped cabin, the world narrowed to heat, smoke, and vibration, the air thick with the scent of oil and fear. His hands, blistered from weeks of labor, gripped the controls as if they were veins connected to his heart. The machine moved as he thought, not as he commanded. Every sound, every tremor, spoke to him. When shells burst around him, he seemed to sense where the next would fall, guiding his creation through explosions as though destiny itself was mapped in his mind. Soldiers who witnessed the Revenant in motion described it not as a tank, but as a living creature, unpredictable, feral, unkillable. It rolled through mud and fire alike, shrugging off hits that would have crippled any other machine. Keller's modifications had turned fragility into resilience, overlapping armor plates scavenged from wrecks, an engine reinforced with stolen aviation parts, a suspension balanced for both speed and shock. It was ugly, heavy, and impossible, yet it worked. The victory that day was small in military terms, but monumental in spirit. When the Revenant broke the Allied line, German soldiers cheered not for the Reich or for survival, but for the proof that something human, creativity, defiance, raw will, still existed amid the collapse. Keller didn't celebrate. He knew his invention wasn't born to save an empire, but to prove a point. When he climbed down from the tank after hours of fighting, he didn't smile. His uniform was torn, his skin burned with oil, his eyes hollow. "It still breathes," he muttered, running his hand along the steel hull as though comforting a wounded friend. The men around him didn't know whether to fear or worship him. Some said he was touched by God, others by madness. Command wanted to know how he'd done it, how he had built something no blueprint could explain. But Keller gave no answers. He simply returned to his camp that night and began working again, torch in hand, hammer striking rhythmically in the dark. For him, the machine was not finished. Perfection was a curse he could not stop chasing, and the Revenant, for all its triumph, was only the beginning of his descent into legend. The winter of 1944 was unlike any other in the European theater. The Ardennes forest, silent and buried under a thick layer of snow, became the stage for one of the most desperate and deceptive operations of the Second World War. The German High Command called it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine, but history would remember it simply as the Battle of the Bulge. It was Hitler's last gamble, a final attempt to split the Allied front and recapture the initiative. And leading the armored spearheads of this colossal counteroffensive were hundreds of Panther tanks, the pride of the Panzerwaffe. Their crews, many veterans of the Eastern Front, were confident. They believed they were about to prove once again that no Allied weapon could stop them. But beneath that confidence lay something unspoken, fear. For the first time, Panther commanders were not entirely sure of their superiority. Reports from France had shaken their faith. Rumors swirled that the Americans had a new gun, one capable of piercing their armor even from long range. Few had seen it. Fewer still believed it. But in the cold forests of Belgium, that doubt was about to turn into horror. The attack began on December 16, 1944. Under cover of snow and fog, German armor surged forward through the Ardennes, crashing into lightly held American lines. The initial success was overwhelming. Entire divisions were thrown into chaos. Columns of Shermans were destroyed on roads slick with ice and mud. German morale soared. Once again, the Panthers were on the offensive, their long guns spitting fire, their engines roaring like beasts in the mist. But the euphoria didn't last. As the weather cleared, the Americans regrouped. Reinforcements poured in, veteran tankers from Patton's Third Army, fresh divisions equipped with the M4A3E8 EZ-8 Shermans, and an ever-growing arsenal of 76mm M1 guns. The German advance, once unstoppable, began to slow. It was in these bitter engagements, in frozen towns like Bastogne, Saint-Vith, and Clairvaux, that the myth of the Panther met its reckoning. Panther crews, accustomed to dictating the terms of battle, now found themselves hunted. The Americans had learned from months of experience how to fight their enemy. They no longer charged blindly into ambushes, they stalked their prey, used terrain, called in artillery, and coordinated every movement. The 76mm M1 gun became their equalizer, a precise, fast-firing weapon that turned every encounter into a deadly contest of reflexes and nerves. One account from the 10th Armored Division tells of a duel near Bastogne that perfectly symbolized this reversal of fortune. A Panther, positioned on a ridge, spotted a column of Shermans crossing open ground. It fired, missing its mark by inches. Before the crew could reload, a Sherman EZ-8 returned fire. The 76mm round struck the Panther's turret ring. The result was catastrophic. By the time the Reich itself began to collapse, Keller was a ghost in uniform. His eyes were hollow but burning, his hands scarred beyond recognition. To those who approached him, he spoke only of design, of torque, balance, and pressure ratios, as if equations had replaced words. The war around him had become irrelevant, all that mattered was the machine. When Germany's surrender became inevitable, officers tried to recall him, to bring his knowledge into the hands of the command, but he ignored them all. One colonel found him working beside the Revenant, its engine torn open again for modification, sparks dancing against the snow. When the colonel demanded obedience, Keller simply said, "The war is over. The machine isn't." He never reported again. Some say he tried to drive the Revenant east to face the Soviets alone, others claim he buried it in the ruins of an old foundry before disappearing. What remained certain was this: the mad mechanic had built something that refused to die, not in metal, but in memory. His legend was now beyond command, beyond victory, beyond reason, the final testament of a man who had made defiance his cry. As the war drew toward its thunderous end in the spring of 1945, the fields of Europe lay strewn with the skeletons of tanks, Panthers, Shermans, Tigers, and countless others, each now silent witnesses to the arrogance and ingenuity of men. Their rusting hulls were more than wreckage, they were lessons written in steel. Lessons about evolution, adaptation, and the fatal cost of underestimation. For the German crews who had once sat inside the mighty Panther, the message came too late. They had trusted in the invincibility of their machine, in its thick armor, in its perfect optics, in the doctrine that no Allied tank could stand before it. But war is not won by perfection, it is won by momentum, innovation, and the will to adapt faster than the enemy can react. And that was where the Americans, armed with their humble yet deadly 76mm M1 gun, triumphed. When the first M4A1, 76, W Shermans appeared in the summer of 1944, few could have predicted the quiet revolution they represented. To most soldiers, they looked the same as every other Sherman. The true change lay inside the barrel, a new high-velocity weapon capable of flinging shells faster, farther, and with greater precision than any previous American tank gun. The 76mm M1 was not born from ambition, but from necessity. American engineers knew that their 75mm guns could no longer compete with the increasing armor thickness of German tanks. The decision to upgun the Sherman wasn't about building a super tank. It was about giving crews a fighting chance. In the crucible of modern warfare, survival was the real currency. This pragmatic design philosophy would define the next generation of Western tanks. Instead of chasing perfection, the Americans embraced versatility, guns that could kill tanks but also fire effective high-explosive rounds for infantry support, engines that could be maintained in the field, and designs that could be mass-produced by the thousands. The Germans, meanwhile, had fallen into the trap of complexity. The Panther, while beautiful in its engineering, demanded resources Germany no longer had. Each one required hundreds of man-hours to build, and when it broke down, as many did, spare parts were scarce. The Americans could afford to lose Shermans, the Germans could not afford to lose Panthers. In the arithmetic of war, efficiency defeats elegance, but the legacy of the 76mm gun went far beyond numbers. It reshaped the psychology of armored warfare. Before its arrival, American tank crews lived under a shadow of fear. They called their tanks Ronsons, like the lighter, they joked, they lit up the first time. Facing Panthers and Tigers had often been an act of bravery more than strategy. The odds were against them, and many paid the price for it. With the new gun, that fear began to fade. Tankers could finally engage the enemy with confidence, not desperation. They learned that the Panther wasn't invincible. That its sides and turret could be penetrated at long range, and that precision and teamwork could offset raw armor. For the first time, American gunners fought not as prey but as equals. That shift in mindset changed the rhythm of the battlefield. Suddenly, the Germans weren't dictating the pace. The Americans were. Sherman's advanced with boldness, often forcing German tanks to reveal their positions. Once spotted, the combination of 76mm fire, artillery, and airstrikes would do the rest. It wasn't just technology that changed, it was belief. The belief that the underdog could evolve faster than the giant, that adaptation could overcome intimidation. In the months that followed, as the Allies crossed the Rhine and pushed into Germany's heartland, the Panther became a ghost of its former glory. Its once feared silhouette was now just another wreck on the roadside. Fuel shortages left many immobilized, their engines silent in the mud. Abandoned Panthers were often captured intact, and American engineers studied them closely, measuring armor thickness, analyzing weak points, and comparing ballistic impacts from the 76mm gun. The findings were remarkable. In multiple tests, the M1's high-velocity armor-piercing rounds were capable of penetrating Panther side armor at over 1,500 yards, distances once thought impossible. Even the frontal armor, if struck at the right angle or with HVAP ammunition, could be breached. The results vindicated the men who had risked everything in Normandy and the Ardennes. Their stories, of duels fought in fog, of shells ricocheting, of tanks burning, now formed the living testimony of how innovation turns the tide of war. Historians would later note that it wasn't any single weapon that won the war, but rather the capacity to innovate faster than the enemy could react. The 76mm M1 embodied that principle perfectly: simple, effective, and timely. The Panther, in contrast, represented the opposite, a marvel of design trapped in a collapsing system that could no longer sustain it. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, and the war in Europe ended, the world entered a new age of military thought. Engineers, generals, and strategists studied every lesson the war had written. They examined the ruins of German and Allied tanks alike, asking one question: what made the difference? The answer, as always, was balance. The 76mm M1 gun was a bridge between eras, the link between the brute force tanks of the early war and the precision firepower of the modern age. Its influence could be traced through the design of the M26 Pershing, the Patton series, and eventually the M60. Each inherited the same philosophy: not to outbuild the enemy, but to outthink them. Armor could be thickened. Guns could be lengthened. But the true weapon was adaptability.